The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou, the capital city of Burkina Faso, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The streets were beginning to stir with the familiar rhythms of daily life, vendors setting up their colorful stalls, children in crisp uniforms walking to school, and the distant sound of motorcycles weaving through the early traffic. It was a morning like any other, yet for President Ibrahim Traoré, something felt profoundly different. Standing in the stone courtyard of the presidential palace, President Traoré gazed out at the manicured gardens that stretched before him. The guards stood in precise formation, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions neutral and professional. Everything appeared orderly, controlled, perfect. But beneath this veneer of normality, a deep restlessness churned within the president's heart. He had not prepared any speeches today. No cabinet meetings were scheduled. No foreign delegations awaited his attention. The day's official calendar was remarkably empty, cleared deliberately by his own hand the night before. For weeks, a single thought had been growing in his mind, becoming more insistent with each passing day. How can I truly understand the suffering of my people if I only see what they want me to see? The question haunted him during sleepless nights. It whispered to him during state dinners. It challenged him when he signed documents and approved policies from the comfortable distance of his executive office. President Traoré had risen to power on promises of reform, transparency, and justice for all citizens. But lately, he had begun to wonder if his connection to the reality of ordinary people's lives had become too tenuous, too filtered through layers of bureaucracy and protocol. "I need to see the truth," he murmured to himself, his hands clasped behind his back. Not the version prepared for presidential visits, not the sanitized reports, the raw, unvarnished truth. His security chief, Colonel Ouedraogo, approached with the day's briefing folder. "Mr. President, shall we review?" "Cancel everything," President Traoré interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going out." The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course, sir. Where shall I tell the motorcade?" No motorcade, 3 vehicles unmarked. No sirens, no flags, no advanced security sweep. Now the colonel's professional composure cracked. "Sir, I must protest. The security protocols." President Traoré turned to face him, and the intensity in his eyes made the colonel fall silent. "Colonel, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you of my decision. Arrange it." 20 minutes later, President Traoré called for his driver, a steady, reliable man named Amadou who had served the palace for 15 years. Amadou stood by the unmarked black sedan, visibly confused by the unusual arrangements. "Amadou," the president said quietly, sliding into the back seat, "take me to the central prison." Amadou's hands froze on the steering wheel. "Sir, the prison, but there's no visit scheduled." "I know," President Traoré replied, his gaze fixed on the city passing by the window. "That's exactly why I'm going. No announcements, no preparations. I want to see reality, not performance." The driver swallowed hard, exchanged a quick glance with the security detail in the following vehicles, and started the engine. The convoy moved through the streets of Ouagadougou like ghosts, silent, unnoticed, unremarkable. Citizens went about their morning routines, completely unaware that their nation's leader was passing mere meters away, without ceremony or fanfare. As they drove, President Traoré watched the city with new eyes. He saw the mothers carrying water jugs on their heads, the young men gathered in small groups with nowhere to go, the elderly sitting in the shade of market stalls. This was the Burkina Faso that existed beyond the polished speeches and diplomatic receptions. This was the country he had sworn to serve. The 40-minute journey felt simultaneously too long and too short. President Traoré's mind raced with questions. What would he find? What truths had been hidden from him? How many injustices had flourished in the shadows while he signed papers in air-conditioned offices? When the 3 vehicles finally pulled up outside the imposing walls of the central prison, Amadou turned in his seat, his expression uncertain. "Sir, are you absolutely certain?" "I am," President Traoré said firmly, already opening the door. The central prison loomed before them, a brutal edifice of gray concrete and rusted iron. The walls were stained with age and neglect, bearing the scars of decades of harsh weather and indifference. This was where society sent those it wished to forget, the accused, the convicted, and too often, the innocent who had no voice to defend themselves. The guards at the entrance snapped to attention when they recognized President Traoré emerging from the vehicle. The shock on their face was unmistakable. One guard nearly dropped his keys, fumbling to maintain his composure. "Mr. President," the senior guard stammered, his voice cracking with panic. We received no notification of your visit, sir. We're not prepared." "That's precisely why I'm here," President Traoré replied evenly. "I don't want preparation, I want truth. Open the gates." The guard hesitated, his training warring with his instinct that something irregular was happening. But presidential authority was absolute. With trembling hands, he unlocked the heavy iron gates, which groaned open with a sound like a wounded animal. Stepping through those gates felt like crossing into another world. The air inside the prison compound was thick and oppressive, heavy with the mingled odors of sweat, unwashed bodies, dampness, and despair. The sounds were equally disturbing, distant shouts, the clang of metal on metal, muffled sobbing, whispered prayers that seemed to seep from the very walls. Colonel Ouedraogo moved close to the president's side, his hand never far from his weapon, his eyes scanning every shadow and corner. The prison director, a portly man named Sankara, came rushing from his office, his shirt hastily buttoned and his face flushed with alarm. "Mr. President, we didn't. If you had only given us notice, we could have arranged a proper tour." "I don't want a tour, Director Sankara," President Traoré said quietly. "I want to see your prison as it truly is. Show me the general population, now." They walked through narrow corridors where paint peeled from the walls and puddles of unidentifiable liquid collected in corners. The lighting was poor, with many bulbs burned out and never replaced. The conditions were far worse than any official report had ever indicated. Finally, they emerged into a large common area where hundreds of prisoners were gathered. The moment President Traoré entered, a ripple of recognition spread through the crowd. Men who had been talking fell silent. Those who had been lying down sat up. Faces turned toward him, some fearful, some curious, many filled with a desperate, fragile hope. President Traoré did something that shocked everyone present. He walked directly into the crowd of prisoners. Colonel Ouedraogo moved to intercept him, but the president waved him back. He began shaking hands with the inmates, looking them in the eyes, asking their names, inquiring about their cases. The prisoners, initially wary, began to respond. Stories poured out, tales of years spent awaiting trial, of evidence that never materialized, of lawyers who never appeared, of families who could no longer afford to visit. "I've been here 6 years, Mr. President," one man said, his voice hoarse. "They say I stole a motorcycle, but the motorcycle was found 2 days later. Still, I'm here, still waiting for someone to care." "9 years for me," another added. "My trial keeps getting postponed. The judge is always too busy." President Traoré listened to each story, his heart growing heavier with every word. These were not abstract statistics in a government report. These were human beings, their lives suspended in a legal limbo, their futures stolen by systemic neglect and corruption. As he moved through the crowd, something caught his attention. In the shadow of a corner cell, partially obscured by the press of bodies, sat a solitary figure. Unlike the others who had stood or approached, this man remained motionless, his head bowed, his posture speaking of utter defeat. President Traoré felt drawn to him. He excused himself from the prisoner he was speaking with and made his way to the corner. Up close, he could see that the man was younger than his weathered appearance suggested, perhaps in his mid-30s. His face bore the lines of profound exhaustion, and his eyes, when he briefly glanced up, were windows into an ocean of pain. "What's your name?" President Traoré asked gently, crouching down to meet the man at eye level. A long silence followed. The man's lips moved as if he had forgotten how to form words. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Emmanuel, sir. My name is Emmanuel." President Traoré extended his hand. Emmanuel stared at it for a long moment before slowly reaching out, his hand trembling as they shook. His grip was weak, as if he had no strength left in his body or his soul. "Emmanuel," the president repeated, settling himself on the ground beside the man, ignoring the gasps from his security detail and the prison staff. "Tell me your story." Emmanuel's eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to blink back. No one in authority had asked him to tell his story in 7 years. No one had cared. And now, impossibly, the president of the nation was sitting beside him in the filth of a prison cell, asking him to speak. I don't know where to begin, sir," Emmanuel said, his voice cracking. "Begin wherever you need to," President Traoré replied. "I'm listening." Emma. Newell took a shuddering breath. 7 years ago, I was a different person. I had a job, a family, hope. I worked as a household servant for a wealthy businessman named Laurent Gaillard. I worked in his home for 8 years, sir. 8 years of loyal service. He paused, gathering the courage to continue. President Traoré remained silent, giving him space. Mr. Gaillard wanted to hire his nephew instead of me. He needed a reason to fire me, but I had done nothing wrong. So he accused me of theft, said I stole money from his safe, a substantial amount. Did you? President Traoré asked directly. Emmanuel's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the president's with a flash of the dignity he once possessed. No, sir. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I never took anything, not even a single franc. I was honest. It was my pride. What happened then? Mr. Gaillard reported the theft to the police, but he didn't just report it, he paid them. I learned later that money changed hands. The police came to my home at night, dragged me from my bed in front of my wife and children. They took me to the station and they beat me, sir, for hours. They beat me until I could barely see, barely think. Then they put papers in front of me and forced me to sign. Emmanuel's hands had begun to shake more violently. I couldn't even read what I was signing. My eyes were swollen shut. They told me if I didn't sign, they would arrest my wife too, put my children in an orphanage. So I signed. I signed my own conviction. President Traoré felt a cold fury building inside him, but he kept his expression neutral, allowing Emmanuel to continue. The trial was a joke, if you can even call it that. It lasted less than 2 days. I had no lawyer. I couldn't afford one, and no one was appointed to help me. Mr. Gaillard brought witnesses, people I had never seen before who said they saw me stealing. The judge barely looked at me. When I tried to speak, to explain, I was told to be quiet. The evidence against me was the confession I signed while being beaten. And the sentence? President Traoré asked quietly. 15 years, Emmanuel whispered. 15 years for a crime I didn't commit. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 15 years, half a lifetime stolen. What happened to your family? The president asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Emmanuel's face crumpled. This clearly was the deepest wound. My wife. She believed me at first. She came to visit, brought the children. But months passed, then a year, then 2. The shame was too much for her. Her family pressured her to leave me to protect the children from the stigma. 3 years ago, she stopped coming. She took the children and went to live with her parents in another city. She divorced me. She had to move on, I understand that. But my children, they were so young. They probably don't even remember me now. Or if they do, they remember me as a criminal, a thief, someone who shamed the family. Tears were now flowing freely down Emmanuel's weathered cheeks. For 7 years, Mr. President, I have existed in this place, but I stopped living long ago. No visitors, no letters, no hope. I wake up each day in this cell and I ask myself, what did I do to deserve this? And I have no answer. I did nothing, nothing but be poor and powerless. He looked directly at President Traoré, and the anguish in his eyes was unbearable. I'm not a man anymore, sir. I'm just a forgotten thing taking up space, waiting to die. 7 years have taught me that justice is not for people like me. Justice is for those who can pay for it. President Traoré remained silent for a long moment, letting Emmanuel's words sink in. Around them, the prison had grown quiet. Other inmates had drawn closer, listening to this unprecedented conversation. They too carried stories like Emmanuel's, stories of corruption, false accusations, and systematic failure. Finally, President Traoré stood up. He looked at Emmanuel with an intensity that made the broken man straighten slightly. Emmanuel, I cannot give you back the 7 years that were stolen from you. But I can promise you this, your suffering will not be meaningless. Today, right now, things begin to change. He turned sharply to Director Sankara, who had been hovering nervously nearby. I want Emmanuel's complete file on my desk by this evening. I want the name of every person involved in his case, the arresting officers, the prosecutor, the judge, the witnesses. I want financial records of his employer. I want everything. The director's face had gone pale. Sir, Yes, of course, but some of these records may be difficult to. I didn't ask about difficulties, President Traoré said coldly. I gave you an order by this evening. If those files are not on my desk, you will be joining these men behind bars. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, Mr. President, Sankara stammered. President Traoré turned back to Emmanuel. Need more time. Hold on a little longer. Help is coming. As he walked toward the exit, the president's mind was already racing. This was not just about one man. Emmanuel's story was a symptom of a much larger disease, a justice system that had become corrupted, a legal framework that protected the powerful and persecuted the vulnerable. If this could happen to Emmanuel, how many others had suffered similar fates? The question was no longer whether to act. The question was how far he was willing to go to fix a broken system. And President Ibrahim Traoré had just made a decision that would reshape the entire nation. The presidential palace was quiet that evening, but in President Traoré's office, the lights burned bright well past midnight. The file on Emmanuel's case lay spread across his desk, a thin, pathetic collection of papers that represented 7 years of a man's life. Minister of Justice Deyuda Kofi had been summoned urgently. He entered the office with obvious trepidation, aware that something significant had happened during the president's unannounced prison visit. "Read this," President Traoré said without preamble, sliding the file across the desk. Minister Kofi opened it and began reading. With each page, his expression grew more troubled. When he finished, he looked up at the president with genuine distress. This is highly irregular, Mr. President. The procedures weren't followed. The evidence is questionable at best." "Questionable?" President Traoré's voice was dangerously soft. "Minister, there is no evidence. There are purchased witnesses, a coerced confession, and a judge who couldn't even be bothered to conduct a proper trial. This isn't justice, it's theater." "Sir, I understand your concern, but the judiciary is independent. We cannot simply overturn." "I'm not interested in overturning anything yet," the president interrupted. "I'm interested in investigating. I want to know the truth. And once we have the truth, we will act accordingly, within the law, but decisively." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. "How many more Emmanuels are out there, Minister? How many innocent people are rotting in our prisons because they were too poor to afford justice?" Minister Kofi was silent for a moment, then admitted quietly, "I don't know, sir. Possibly hundreds." "Then we're going to find out. I'm authorizing the creation of a special task force. You will lead it. I want investigators, independent lawyers, human rights experts. Their mandate is simple: review every case where there are questions about the conviction. No politics, no favoritism, just truth." "Sir, such an undertaking would be massive. The resources required will be provided," President Traoré said firmly. "This is now a national priority. I want weekly reports directly to me." Over the next week, an elite team was assembled. Among them were Fatima Sawadogo, a brilliant lawyer known for her work with the poor; Inspector Dramane Ouattara, a police investigator with an impeccable reputation for integrity; and Dr. Aminata Kabore, a forensic expert who had trained abroad and returned to serve her country. Their investigation into Emmanuel's case moved quickly. Inspector Ouattara began with the arresting officers. 2 had left the force years ago, 1 fired for corruption, another who had mysteriously acquired enough money to open a business shortly after Emmanuel's arrest. The 3rd officer, Sergeant Bila, still worked at the same precinct. When Ouattara brought him in for questioning, the sergeant was defiant at first. "I was following orders," Bila insisted. "The evidence pointed to him." "What evidence?" Ouattara asked, laying out the file. "There were no fingerprints on the safe. No witnesses saw him take the money. No money was ever recovered. The only evidence was a confession he signed after being beaten for hours." Bila's defiance began to crumble. "Look, I was a junior officer. My superiors told me what to do." "Your superiors or Laurent Gaillard's money?" The sergeant's silence was damning. Finally, he muttered, "Gaillard had friends in the department, important friends. We were told not to ask questions." Meanwhile, Fatima Sawadogo tracked down the witnesses who had testified against Emmanuel. The first 2 had moved away years ago, but the 3rd, a man named Seydou, still lived in Ouagadougou. When Fatima appeared at his door with official credentials, his face went white. "I have nothing to say," he tried to close the door. Fatima stopped him. "You testified that you saw Emmanuel Traoré steal money from Laurent Gaillard's safe. Were you telling the truth?" I said what I was supposed to say." "Which was?" Seydou looked around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "Gaillard paid me, paid all of us, told us exactly what to say in court, threatened us if we refused. I needed the money. My daughter was sick. I told myself it was just one man, just one case. I didn't know he'd get 15 years. I swear I didn't know. The man's confession was recorded, witnessed, and certified. It was damning evidence that the entire case had been fabricated. The most difficult part was investigating the judge, Justice Marcel Dow. As a sitting judge, he was protected by judicial immunity and could not be easily questioned. But Dr. Caboret discovered something interesting while reviewing financial records. Judge Dow had made several large deposits to his bank account in the month following Emmanuel's trial, deposits that far exceeded his official salary. When this information was presented to the Judicial Council, they reluctantly agreed to open an internal investigation. Under questioning, Justice Dow initially maintained his innocence, but when presented with the financial evidence, the false witness testimonies, and the documented police brutality, his defense collapsed. I was approached by representatives of Mr. Gaillard, he finally admitted. They made it clear that cooperation would be rewarded and refusal would be problematic. I have a family, debts. I convinced myself that the defendant was probably guilty anyway, that I was just streamlining the process. You sentenced an innocent man to 15 years to pay off your debts, Minister Kofi said coldly. You betrayed your oath, your office, and your country. 3 weeks after President Traoré's visit to the prison, the task force presented their complete report. The conclusion was unequivocal. Emmanuel was innocent. The case against him had been entirely manufactured by Laurent Gaillard, facilitated by corrupt police officers and a judge who had sold his integrity for cash. President Traoré read the report in silence. When he finished, he closed the folder and sat for a long moment with his eyes closed. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. Gentlemen, lady, what you have uncovered is not just one miscarriage of justice. You have exposed the rot at the heart of our system. If this can happen once, it can happen 1,000 times, and I believe it has. He looked at each team member in turn. You have done exceptional work, but this is only the beginning. I want this investigation expanded. Every suspicious case, every questionable conviction, every instance where justice may have been denied, I want them all reviewed. Mr. President, Fatima said carefully, such an undertaking could destabilize the entire judicial system. Good, President Traoré replied. A system this broken needs to be destabilized. We will rebuild it on the foundation of truth and fairness. But first we have one man to free and one guilty man to arrest. The morning President Traoré returned to the central prison, he brought the media with him. Cameras from national television, reporters from newspapers, international journalists. He wanted the whole world to witness what was about to happen. Emmanuel sat in his cell, unaware of the commotion outside. When he heard his name called, he assumed it was for some routine prisoner count or work detail. He shuffled out of his cell, his movements slow and defeated. Then he saw the crowd, the cameras, the officials in their formal attire, and at the center of it all, President Traoré walking directly toward him. Emmanuel's legs nearly gave out. He tried to back away, confused and frightened. Had he done something wrong? Was his situation about to get even worse? President Traoré stopped in front of him and spoke clearly, his words captured by a dozen microphones. Emmanuel, 3 weeks ago I met you in this prison. You told me you were innocent, that you had been betrayed by the system meant to protect you. I promised you that I would seek the truth. He held up the investigation report. The truth has been found. You are innocent, Emmanuel. Every charge against you was false. You were framed by your employer, betrayed by corrupt police, and failed by a judge who sold his oath for money. Emmanuel swayed on his feet, unable to process what he was hearing. Sir, I don't. Is this real? President Traoré smiled, a genuine, warm smile. It's real. Effective immediately, you are a free man. All charges are dismissed. You will receive compensation from the state for the years stolen from you. And more than that, you have my personal apology on behalf of the nation that failed you. The prison erupted. Inmates cheered and wept. Guards stood in stunned silence. The watching media captured every moment, Emmanuel's legs finally giving way, President Traoré catching him, the two men embracing while Emmanuel sobbed into the president's shoulder, 7 years of anguish finally released. When Emmanuel had composed himself enough to stand, President Traoré personally escorted him toward the prison gates. With each step, Emmanuel kept looking back, as if afraid this was all a dream that would evaporate. They reached the gates. The heavy iron barriers that had confined him for 7 years swung up. And Emmanuel stepped through them and stopped, overcome. He looked up at the sky, truly looked at it for the first time in years. He felt the breeze on his face. He heard the sounds of the city, free sounds, unfiltered by walls and bars. A journalist thrust a microphone toward him. "Emmanuel, how does it feel to be free?" Emmanuel's voice was rough with emotion. "I don't know yet. For so long, I wasn't a person. I was just a number, a forgotten thing. Now you tell me I'm free, but I don't remember how to be free. My family is gone. My home is gone. My life is gone, but maybe now I can build a new one." That evening, Emmanuel was taken not to a shelter or halfway house, but to a guest residence at the presidential palace. A clean bed with soft sheets, hot food prepared by skilled chefs, safety, dignity. He could barely sleep that night, overwhelmed by the contrast with his cell. Every time he closed his eyes, he expected to wake up back in prison, to discover this had all been a cruel dream. Several times he woke gasping, disoriented, before remembering where he was. The next morning, President Traoré invited him to breakfast. As they sat together, the president asked him to tell his full story again, not the abbreviated version from the prison, but everything. His childhood, his dreams, his life before the nightmare began. Emmanuel spoke for nearly 2 hours. He talked about growing up poor but hopeful, about his desire to become a teacher, about meeting his wife and the joy of his children's births. He spoke about his 8 years of honest work for Gaylord, never imagining it would end in betrayal. And he spoke about the darkness of prison, the gradual death of hope, the slow erosion of his humanity. President Traoré listened to every word. When Emmanuel finished, the president said something that would change everything. "Emmanuel, I want you to work with me. I'm expanding the investigation into wrongful convictions across the entire country. You know what it's like to be trapped in a broken system. Your experience, your perspective, it's invaluable. Will you help us prevent this from happening to others?" Emmanuel was speechless. "Mr. President, I have no education, no qualifications. How could I possibly?" "You have something more important than degrees," President Traoré interrupted. "You have moral authority. When you speak about injustice, people will listen because you've lived it. When you say the system needs to change, no one can dismiss you as an outsider who doesn't understand. You are the voice this movement needs." Emmanuel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of purpose, not pain. "I accept," he said simply. "If my suffering can prevent others from suffering the same way, then perhaps it wasn't meaningless after all." The press conference 3 days later sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso. President Traoré stood at a podium in the main government hall, with Emmanuel beside him, no longer a prisoner but dressed in a clean suit, standing tall with recovered dignity. "My fellow citizens," President Traoré began, "I stand before you today to acknowledge a painful truth. Our justice system has failed many of you. For too long, we have allowed corruption, incompetence, and indifference to poison the institutions meant to protect the innocent and punish the guilty." He gestured to Emmanuel. This man was imprisoned for 7 years for a crime he did not commit. He lost his family, his freedom, and nearly his life because wealthy and powerful people conspired to frame him, and our system allowed it to happen. But Emmanuel's case is not unique. We have reason to believe hundreds, perhaps thousands, of our citizens have suffered similar injustices. The room erupted with questions from journalists. President Traoré raised his hand for silence. "Therefore, I am announcing the creation of Operation Light of Justice. This will be a comprehensive review of every questionable conviction in our prison system. We will examine every case where evidence is weak, where proper procedure was not followed, where accusations of corruption or coercion exist. And where we find innocence, we will act swiftly to correct these terrible wrongs." He turned to Emmanuel. "Mr. Emmanuel Traoré will serve as special advisor on justice reform and human rights. He will lead teams visiting prisons nationwide, interviewing inmates, reviewing cases, and identifying those who deserve new trials or immediate release." The appointment was controversial. Critics argued that a man with no legal training had no business in such a position, but President Traoré was unmoved. "Emmanuel doesn't need a law degree to recognize injustice. He's lived it. That makes him the perfect person to find others suffering as he did." Within days, Operation Light of Justice was operational. Emmanuel, despite his lack of formal education, proved to be a remarkably effective leader, perhaps because he had experienced the worst the system could do. He had an instinct for recognizing similar cases. His first visit was to Bobo Dioulasso prison, one of the most notorious facilities in the country. The conditions were appalling: overcrowded cells, inadequate food, rampant disease. Many prisoners had been there for years without trial, their files lost or forgotten. Emmanuel walked through the prison with a team of lawyers and investigators. He stopped to talk with inmates, asking the same questions President Traoré had asked him. What were you accused of? Did you have a lawyer? What evidence was presented? The stories he heard were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Farmers accused of crimes they couldn't have committed because they were working their fields at the time. Young men imprisoned because they looked like someone else. Women jailed for months because they couldn't afford bail for minor offenses. One case particularly struck Emmanuel, a man named Isa who had been in prison for 12 years. "What was your crime?" Emmanuel asked. Isa's voice was hollow. "They said I robbed a shop, but I was at home with my mother. She was dying and I was caring for her. I tried to tell them, but no one listened. My mother died while I was in here. I never got to say goodbye. They wouldn't even let me attend her funeral." Emmanuel felt a painful kinship with this man. Different details, but the same fundamental injustice: a powerless person crushed by a system that didn't care enough to seek truth. "We're going to review your case," Emmanuel promised. "If you're innocent, and I believe you are, we'll get you out of here." Over the following weeks, Emmanuel's team identified 127 cases that merited immediate investigation. They ranged from minor offenses with sentences that had long since been served, to major crimes with virtually no evidence to support the convictions. Each evening, Emmanuel would return to his office, a modest room he insisted on keeping simple despite offers of more luxurious accommodations, and write reports. His writing was sometimes clumsy, his grammar imperfect, but his observations were sharp and his moral clarity was unshakable. President Traoré read every report personally. One evening, as he reviewed Emmanuel's findings, he called a meeting with his entire cabinet. "I want you all to read this," he said, distributing copies of Emmanuel's latest report. "This is not comfortable reading. Emmanuel has documented case after case of people imprisoned unjustly, but he's also documented something else: the systematic failures that allowed this to happen, lazy judges, corrupt police, prosecutors who care more about conviction rates than truth, a legal aid system that exists only on paper." He looked around the table at his ministers. "We're going to fix this, all of it. We're going to reform the police force, restructure the judiciary, expand legal aid, and create oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. This is not optional. This is not something we'll get to eventually. This is our top priority, second only to the security of the nation." The Minister of Finance objected. "Mr. President, the cost of such reforms is less than the cost of allowing injustice to continue." President Traoré cut him off. "When citizens don't trust the justice system, they take justice into their own hands. That leads to vigilantism, to cycles of revenge, to the breakdown of civil society. Investing in justice is investing in stability." The reforms began immediately. New judges were recruited and trained, with an emphasis on integrity and compassion. Police officers underwent retraining in proper investigative procedures and respect for human rights. A well-funded public defender's office was established to ensure every accused person had legal representation. But the most dramatic moments came when Emmanuel's investigations led to the release of wrongfully imprisoned individuals. Each release was public, covered by media, serving both to restore the dignity of the wronged person and to demonstrate the government's commitment to justice. The 15th person released was a young woman named Fadu. She had been imprisoned for 3 years for allegedly selling stolen goods, goods that turned out to have never been stolen at all. The victim, who accused her, had been trying to evade taxes by claiming items as stolen rather than sold. When Fadu walked out of prison, Emmanuel was there to greet her. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "I thought no one would ever believe me," she wept. "I thought I would die in there." "You're free now," Emmanuel said gently, "and we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." As Operation Light of Justice gained momentum, attention inevitably turned to the perpetrators of these injustices. President Traoré had been clear from the beginning. This was not only about freeing the innocent, but also about holding the guilty accountable. Laurent Gaillard, the wealthy businessman who had framed Emmanuel, had until now assumed his wealth and connections would keep him safe. When police arrived at his door, he was stunned. "What is the meaning of this?" he protested as Inspector Ouattara presented an arrest warrant. "Do you know who I am? I have ministers as friends." "And I answer to the president," Ouattara replied calmly. "Laurent Gaillard, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, bribery of police officers, and obstruction of justice." Gaillard's face turned purple with rage. "This is ridiculous. I'll have your badge, "You'll have your day in court," Ouattara interrupted. "Just like Ibrahim Traoré had his, except this time the trial will be fair." The arrest made headlines across the nation. For decades, wealthy and powerful individuals had operated with impunity, confident that money could buy them protection from consequences. Gaillard's arrest sent shockwaves through the elite circles. If someone of his stature could be held accountable, no one was untouchable. The corrupt police officers who had beaten Emmanuel and forced him to sign a false confession were arrested next. Sergeant Bila, who had cooperated with investigators, received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. The other two officers, who had fled and tried to hide, were hunted down and brought back to face justice. Justice Marcel Dow, the judge who had sold his integrity, was the most difficult case. His arrest required approval from the Supreme Judicial Council, which initially resisted, citing judicial independence. But when President Traoré personally appeared before the council and presented the overwhelming evidence of corruption, they had no choice but to act. Judicial independence exists to protect justice, not to shield criminals wearing robes, the president told them. When a judge betrays his oath, he forfeits the protection of his office. The trial of Laurent Gaillard was held in the same courthouse where Emmanuel had been convicted 7 years earlier. But this time, everything was different. The courtroom was packed with journalists, human rights observers, and ordinary citizens who had waited years to see a powerful man face real consequences. Emmanuel attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row. It was painful for him to be back in that courtroom, but he felt he needed to witness this moment. President Traoré often sat beside him, a silent show of solidarity. The prosecution, led by a team of the nation's finest lawyers, systematically dismantled Gaillard's defense. They presented the false witnesses who now admitted they had been paid to lie. They showed financial records proving bribes had been paid to police and the judge. They played recordings of Gaillard discussing his plan to frame Emmanuel with his associates. Gaillard's expensive lawyers did their best, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the false witness Seydou took the stand and tearfully confessed to lying in exchange for money, even Gaillard's supporters in the courtroom fell silent. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution called Emmanuel to the stand. He walked slowly to the witness box, his legs still unsteady after years of imprisonment. When asked to recount what had happened to him, his voice was quiet but firm. "I worked for Mr. Gaillard for 8 years, Emmanuel began. "I was loyal, honest, hardworking. When he decided he no longer wanted me, he didn't just fire me, he destroyed my life. He took away my freedom, my family, my dignity. He did this not because I wronged him, but because he could, because he thought people like me didn't matter." Emmanuel's eyes met Gaillard's across the courtroom. "For 7 years I lived in a cell believing I would die there. I lost everything, my wife, my children, my hope, but I survived. And now I stand here free while you sit where I once sat. That is justice." The courtroom was absolutely silent when Emmanuel finished. Even the defense lawyers seemed shaken. When the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Laurent Gaillard was sentenced to 12 years in prison, not as long as Emmanuel's sentence had been, but sufficient to show that the law applied to everyone, regardless of wealth or status. As Gaillard was led away in handcuffs, he turned and glared at Emmanuel with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "My family will appeal, my lawyers will." "We'll do exactly what the law allows," the judge interrupted sternly. "And not one thing more. Justice has been blind to wealth for too long in this country. That changes now." The trials and convictions of Gaillard and his co-conspirators marked a turning point, but President Traoré and Emmanuel both knew that punishing individual criminals, while necessary, was not enough. The entire system needed to be rebuilt. Minister of Justice Kofi presented a comprehensive reform package to the National Assembly. It included mandatory video recording of all police interrogate, irons to prevent coerced confessions, automatic appointment of public defenders for anyone who couldn't afford a lawyer, independent review boards to investigate accusations of judicial corruption, strict time limits on pretrial detention to prevent people from languishing in prison for years without trial, regular audits of all prison facilities by independent human rights organizations, compensation fund for victims of wrongful conviction. The reforms met resistance from those who benefited from the old system. Some judges complained about increased oversight. Some police officers protested the new requirements as burdensome. Some wealthy defendants objected to losing the advantages their money had previously bought them. But President Traoré was unmoved. In a televised address to the nation, he was blunt. If these reforms make your job harder, perhaps you are doing your job wrong. Justice should never be easy for those who seek to subvert it. It should only be easy for those who pursue truth. Emmanuel became the public face of the reform movement. His story resonated with ordinary citizens who had long felt that the justice system was rigged against them. He traveled to every region of the country, speaking at town halls, visiting prisons, meeting with victims of injustice. His lack of formal education, which critics had initially cited as a weakness, became his greatest strength. He spoke in simple, direct language that everyone could understand. He didn't use legal jargon or complicated theories. He simply told his story and explained why the reforms mattered. "I am not special," he would say at every gathering. "What happened to me could happen to any of you, to your sons, to your brothers. That's why we must fix this broken system, not for me because I am free now, but for everyone who comes after us." 6 months into Operation Light of Justice, the results were undeniable. 237 wrongfully convicted individuals had been released. 14 judges had been removed from the bench for corruption or incompetence. 43 police officers had been fired or criminally charged. The public's confidence in the justice system, which had been at historic lows, began to slowly recover. But perhaps the most meaningful change was cultural. For generations, ordinary Burkinabe had accepted that justice was only for the rich and powerful. Now, for the first time, they began to believe that the system might actually work for them too. One evening, 18 months after his release, Emmanuel received an unexpected visitor at his office. His assistant knocked hesitantly on his door. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your wife." Emmanuel's heart stopped. He hadn't heard from Amina in 3 years. The divorce papers had arrived at the prison with no note, no explanation, just legal finality. He had accepted it as one more thing the prison had taken from him. "Send her in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina entered slowly, her eyes red from crying. She looked older than Emmanuel remembered, worn down by struggles he could only imagine. They stood in silence for a long moment, neither knowing how to begin. Finally, Amina spoke. "I saw you on television. I've been following everything you've done. Emmanuel, I came to apologize." "You have nothing to apologize for," Emmanuel said gently. "You did what you had to do to survive, to protect our children. I understand." "No," Amina shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "I should have believed in you longer. I should have fought harder. The pressure from my family, the shame, the whispers in the community, I let it break my faith in you, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." She stepped closer, her voice cracking with emotion. "I watched you speak on television about forgiveness, about rebuilding, about not letting bitterness destroy you. And I thought, he is a better person than I am. He lost everything and emerged with his soul intact. I lost only my husband, and I became bitter and angry." Emmanuel felt his own tears beginning to fall. "Amina, we both survived the only way we knew how. There is nothing to forgive." "But there is," she insisted. "I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I didn't know how to love you through that much pain, but if you'll let me, I want to try again. The children are older now, they ask about you. They've seen you on television too. They want to know their father." Emmanuel's composure finally broke. He had dreamed of this moment countless times in his cell, but had long since convinced himself it would never happen. Now, standing before the woman he had never stopped loving, he felt 7 years of walls beginning to crumble. "I would like that," he said softly. "I would like that very much." The reconciliation was not instant or magical. Too much pain had passed between them. But they began slowly, coffee meetings that became dinners. nerves that became family outings with the children. Emmanuel's son, now 13, was cautious at first, remembering only fragments of his father. His daughter, only 8 when Emmanuel was imprisoned, barely knew him at all. But children are resilient, and as they spent time with their father, this man who spoke on television about justice and forgiveness, who had somehow transformed suffering into purpose, they began to see past the lost years. One Sunday afternoon, Emmanuel's son asked him, "Papa, are you angry at the people who put you in prison?" Emmanuel thought carefully before answering. "I was angry for a long time. Anger kept me alive when hopelessness tried to kill me. But President Traoré taught me something important. Anger is useful for breaking down bad systems, but you cannot build good ones with anger alone. You need hope for that. You need to believe people can be better." "Do you believe that?" his daughter asked. Emmanuel smiled. "I have to. If I don't believe people can change, can become better, then what was the point of everything we've done? President Traoré believed I deserved justice when everyone else had forgotten me. I have to extend that same belief to others." 2 years after his first visit to the central prison, President Traoré stood once again in the prison courtyard. But this time, everything was different. The facility had been renovated, still a prison, but now clean, with adequate lighting, proper sanitation, and humane conditions. More importantly, the population had decreased by nearly 40%. Thanks to the reforms, people were no longer held indefinitely without trial. Cases were processed efficiently. Those who deserved to be in prison were there, those who didn't had been released. Emmanuel walked beside him, now formally appointed as the National Human Rights Commissioner, a new position created specifically for him. Together, they met with current inmates, listening to their concerns, ensuring the reforms were being properly implemented. After the visit, as they drove back to the capital, President Traoré turned to Emmanuel. "Do you ever regret it? All those years you lost, they can never be given back." Emmanuel was quiet for a moment, watching the countryside pass by the window. "Of course I regret the lost time with my family, the years I can never recover. But I've learned something, Mr. President. Suffering without meaning is unbearable. Suffering with purpose is survivable. You gave my suffering purpose." "You gave it purpose yourself," President Traoré corrected. "I only opened a door, you chose to walk through it." "Then we did it together," Emmanuel smiled. "And because we did, hundreds of others have walked through that same door into freedom." President Traoré nodded. "But we're not finished. There are still problems in the system, still injustices we haven't addressed." "Then we keep working," Emmanuel said simply. "One case at a time, one person at a time, until the day when stories like mine become impossible, not because we're watching constantly, but because the system itself has become just." That evening, President Traoré gave a speech at the National University, addressing a hall full of law students, the next generation of judges, prosecutors, and defenders. Emmanuel sat in the front row, listening. "Justice," the president told them, "is not an abstract concept debated in classrooms and written in dusty law books. Justice is what happens when a man is freed after 7 years of false imprisonment. Justice is what happens when the powerful face consequences for their crimes. Justice is what happens when a broken system admits its failures and chooses to rebuild." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Many of you will graduate and join a justice system that, while improved, is still imperfect. You will face pressures to compromise your integrity. You will encounter powerful people who expect special treatment. You will see injustices that seem too entrenched to fight. When those moments come, I want you to think of Emmanuel Traoré. Think of a man who spent 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, who emerged not with bitterness but with purpose, who chose to channel his suffering into preventing others from suffering the same way. That is the standard I ask you to uphold. Not perfection, none of us is perfect, but integrity, courage, compassion, the willingness to stand for truth even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you personally. Because justice is not just a system of laws and courts. Justice is a choice we make every day, the choice to see the humanity in every person who comes before us, the choice to seek truth over convenience, the choice to protect the powerless even when the powerful demand otherwise. The students rose in applause. Emmanuel, too, stood, his eyes shining with tears of gratitude and hope. 5 years after President Traoré's first visit to the central prison, Burkina Faso. O's justice system had been transformed. It was far from perfect. No system ever is, but it was unrecognizably better than what had existed before. The wrongful conviction rate had dropped dramatically. Legal aid was now truly available to all who needed it. Police brutality, while not eliminated, had been significantly reduced through better training and real accountability. Judges who took bribes faced swift removal and prosecution. The culture had shifted from one of impunity to one of responsibility. Ibrahim Traoré, now widely respected as the nation's moral voice on justice issues, had reunited fully with his family. His children were thriving. His son had decided to study law, inspired by his father's story. His daughter, creative and expressive, spoke of becoming a journalist to expose injustice. On a warm evening, Emmanuel stood before a gathering at the National Monument of Justice, a memorial erected to honor all victims of wrongful imprisonment. President Traoré had invited him to speak at the dedication ceremony. Emmanuel looked out at the crowd. Thousands of people, including many he had personally helped free, many whose cases had been reopened because of Operation Light of Justice, and many ordinary citizens who simply believed in the power of justice and redemption. 5 years ago, Emmanuel began, his voice stronger and more confident than the whisper it had once been. I was not even a person in the eyes of the law. I was a number, a forgotten thing, a man without hope. Today I stand before you as proof that no one is beyond redemption, no system beyond reform, and no injustice beyond correction, if we have the courage to face the truth. This monument honors those who suffered as I did, but it also honors those who chose to act when action was required. President Traoré, who could have stayed in his comfortable palace, but chose instead to see the ugly truth of our prisons. Minister Kofi, who chose comprehensive reform over political convenience. Fatima Sawadogo, Inspector Ouattara, Dr. Kabore, and so many others who investigated, documented, and exposed injustices even when it was difficult and dangerous. Most of all, this monument honors a simple idea, that justice belongs to everyone, not just the rich, not just the powerful, not just those who can afford lawyers and bribes. Justice belongs to the poor farmer, the street vendor, the unemployed youth, the voiceless and forgotten, to every citizen of this nation. Emmanuel paused, emotion thick in his throat. I lost 7 years of my life to injustice. I cannot get those years back, but I have gained something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. Even the most broken system can be repaired. Even the most forgotten person can be remembered. To those who are fighting for justice anywhere in the world, in your own countries, in your own communities, in your own lives, I say this: never give up. Never accept that injustice is inevitable or unchangeable. One person with courage can spark a movement. One act of compassion can transform a nation. One decision to seek truth can free hundreds of innocent people. We are not perfect, we still make mistakes, we still have work to do. But we are trying, we are building. We are day by day creating a system worthy of the beautiful principle we call justice. Emmanuel's final words rang out across the crowd. The light of justice may flicker, it may dim, it may seem at times to go out entirely. But it can never be extinguished as long as there are people willing to fight for it, to nurture it, to pass it on to the next generation. That light now burns bright in Burkina Faso. May it shine as an example to the world. President Traoré stepped forward and embraced Emmanuel as the crowd erupted in applause. In that moment, two men, one a president who had chosen to see, and one a prisoner who had chosen to forgive, stood together as living proof that leadership combined with moral courage could indeed change a nation. The monument's inscription, written in French and Moor, would be read by generations to come. In memory of all who suffered unjustly in our prisons, in honor of all who fought to free them, in hope that such injustices will never happen again. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice finally achieved is hope restored. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the monument, Emmanuel stood with his wife and children beside him, knowing that while he could never recover what was lost, he had found something equally precious: purpose, redemption, and the power to ensure that his suffering had not been meaningless. The light of justice, once nearly extinguished in his own life, now burned brightly across an entire nation. And that light, carefully tended and fiercely protected, would continue to illuminate the path toward a more just world for all who came after. The end.